welcome everyone. Appreciate the introduction. It's a real pleasure to present this webinar today. I've been at Ausmed for over 10 years now. The passion that I truly hold and the topic of my master's thesis is around education. My background is in intensive care as a nurse, but I've worked internationally setting the scope and standards of practice for nurses that work in professional development or learning and development. I'm the director of our provider unit here at Ausmed. That's the only accredited provider with distinction with the ANCC. But over the last 18 months or so, I've been deep in the clinical governance world, where I've really focused on understanding and applying regulation, risk and compliance, relevant to you, all of our providers and learners to Ausmed. So I'm really excited to be here today. There's obviously a huge change taking place within the sector, and we're really proud to be able to support you all through that change. So I'll just start by acknowledging that this webinar today is being held on the lands of the traditional Wurundjeri people, and so I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So the outline for today, we've got the next hour or so together, and I've broken the webinar up into 4 parts. Part 1, we're going to look at the impact of the new standards and focus that impact on you L&D teams. Part 2, we will look at the results of Ausmed's gap analysis, some really interesting things that we've learnt there, which we will share. Part 3, we're going to then focus on creating your plan or suggesting a plan that we think will support you all over the next few months and leave with some resources and practical support. So a couple of learning outcomes. We hope that as a result of engaging in today's webinar that you really should gain a clearer understanding of the educational implications of the strengthened aged care standards and understand what that impact looks like for you and your team. And I want you to leave here being more confident that you have a plan and that you're going to be able to meet that plan with regards to your training. So we're really looking at confidence around planning how you will implement the required education to meet these new requirements. Okay, so what I just want to start with is, I guess, sharing what our focus is. So we know that the release and of course the rollout and subsequent 6-12 months at least of new regulatory standards, it really is an organisational wide effort. As the saying goes, it takes a village, and that's certainly the case when we're introducing key regulation, as we are all going to be doing. So we really require a coordinated approach, but know that this is how we can support you. We can support you to build your knowledge of the educational implications of the standards, and we can support you to plan and implement an appropriate training program that's designed to help meet the identified requirements. So that's our focus and that's our pledge. That's how we're here to support you over the next few months. 45 minutes is a good amount of time to be together today, but it's not going to cover all of the required topics that are needed as we head towards July 1. So I really encourage you to attend as many of the webinars as you can. We've designed and structured these in a way that we really try and systematically build on your knowledge, your confidence, and your preparedness towards July 1. So you can see today that we're starting with a general understanding, helping you build that confidence around knowing the educational implications. We will then examine next webinar a key part of the new standards, which are outcomes. I'll come to that shortly. And then move through designing your training programs. A really exciting one, our June webinar looks at moving from compliance to competence, which I know a lot of people are talking about and we're really excited to share some of our progress there. And then we'll finish up post July 1 with our webinar about 3 weeks or so after the release of the standards, if all goes to plan and they are approved and released on July 1, where we'll really practically look at how we're reporting against the new standards in the LMS. So really encourage you to try and see this as a series. Aside from the Wednesday of just after Labor Day, there are every Tuesday for the next month. So pop that in your calendars. In terms of questions during the webinar, I know myself, I've had so many questions on the new standards, the new act, the new regulatory model. There's a lot of new learning that we're all doing, and it's a really fantastic opportunity today to kickstart your planning if you haven't already. So I really do encourage you to ask questions, and we will do our best to answer them as best we can. But when it comes to regulation and when it comes to those specific regulatory requirements, my belief is that obviously getting that correct information is really critical, and regulation can be interpreted differently, but there are always little intricacies of that regulation. So if there's a question around the regulatory model or something specific that I don't know the answer to, we will use our direct line with the Commission to make sure that we answer that correctly and share that with all of the all of those who are attending the webinar. So post your questions during the webinar into the chat. We'll do our best to answer them. There'll be time at the end for questions, but as I said, if we can't answer anything during, we will do our best to follow up and use that content partnership that we have with the Commission to find that information out for you. All right, though, so let's start with part one. We're going to look at the impact of the new standards and focus specifically on what this means for you in learning and development. So I guess I'll start by asking a question. You know, we're all talking about it. We're starting to make plans. You know, why is it that quality standards or regulatory standards, why do they matter? You know, why is this such a critical, few months and year for us all? And I guess I'd respond by saying we need to think about regulation as being the biggest input into a needs assessment. So when we're thinking about, you know, what education is needed, what topics do we need to cover? There are a range of factors that will influence the training requirements of an aged care provider. We've got, quality indicator data, feedback, complaints. We're looking at trends. We're looking at clinical risk and how we mitigate that. There's a lot of drivers into us deciding what education do we need and how do we respond to that. But the most significant input into a training schedule is conformance with regulatory standards. Why? Again, why is that? It's because we know that standards literally define and they set that minimum level of care and governance expected and required. So I say that not to overwhelm, but to really encourage you to think of this as an opportunity, because you have a vehicle of regulation behind you that is going to trigger multiple educational requirements that you can use to drive change. This is a significant opportunity for you to use education and training to improve care. We've identified 4 key changes that relate to learning and development with regards to the new standards. The first and most critical by far is outcomes. Why? Outcomes are the enforceable element of the new standards. We're going to tap into these a little bit more. Second key change is that we've identified over 100 requirements. So specific care and clinical skills derived directly from the new standards that will need an educational response to. As many people have been talking about already, there is an even greater need now for effective education. The new standards specifically call out instances where competency-based training is required. And the fourth key change is a specific action, again, we're going to cover that in a minute, that actually looks at the effectiveness of a training system. There is a new requirement that says you must ensure that you've got an effective training system and you've got a process and taking measures to ensure that that training system is achieving your training program. So some really exciting changes. Let's look at the first one of outcomes. All right, so some of you, hopefully, I've got the link if you haven't had a chance to watch it, but the Commission ran a fabulous webinar a couple of Tuesdays ago, 6th of Feb, where they highlighted a lot of key information that I think we all need to digest. It's not the right forum in this webinar because it covers the whole of the regulatory model. We're focusing, our efforts on learning and development, but I really encourage you to watch it. One of the key points from this webinar is that outcomes are the enforceable element. What does that mean? So if you imagine the new standards are broken up, that we've got at our highest level, we've got a standard. And I'm referring to the structure of the standards. The next level down, we have outcomes, and there are 33 outcomes associated to each standard. And then we have our action, so our practical response. What they have confirmed is that from July 1, outcomes will be the enforceable element, meaning outcomes will need to be achieved. The 33 outcomes will need to be achieved, and they will be the focal point of an audit. So as I mentioned, there's 33 outcomes and there's multiple actions attached to this. So the importance of outcomes is so great that the requirement to meet these outcomes will be enshrined in the legislation via the Aged Care Act, which we know is in consultation and hopefully moving through Parliament soon. So what that means is that during an audit, the evidence collected will focus specifically on how well a provider is achieving those outcomes. So rather than looking at, I guess, a list and understanding, did this happen, did this happen, did this happen, they will need to prove that they're meeting an outcome. I've got a great resource which I will show you towards the end of this webinar that actually goes through the types of questions and evidence that they will be collecting with regards to these outcomes. But what I want to reassure you with is that when we have conducted our gap analysis, we have analysed the specific requirements of the outcomes. So we're not just looking at the content of the standards, we're looking at the outcomes, and we are mapping our content and identifying what educational requirements are coming from the new standards based on the outcomes. So I want you to all, I guess, understand that there is a shift towards outcomes, and that is the element of the standards. So when we think of that structure, that we need to be focusing on. Second key point is there are over 100 identified requirements, and these are specific care and clinical skills that our assessment is necessitate not just general training on the standards, but targeted education to meet what's in the standards. So I'll just say that again because I think it's a really critical point. Most providers will be providing education that is of a general nature on the standards. What are the new standards? How many are there? What are the new names? And what are some key points from the standards? Now, that is important. We need to provide our workforce with an opportunity to build their general knowledge about the standards. But how we see this playing out, if a provider just provides general training on the standards and not targeted education on what's actually in the standards, is that from July 1st, when auditing commences, and Commissioner Janet Anderson made clear in that webinar that there is an expectation for compliance from July 1, meaning from July 1, audits will commence and there is an expectation to be compliant. She has said that with that, she understands that it is a process and it takes time to implement new changes. But in order for conformance to be met, providers will need to be showing substantial progress towards meeting the new requirements directly on from July 1. So coming back to the identified requirements, it is our belief that if education and training budgets are only spent on these foundational training activities, which aren't bad and will be quite common, that from July 1, there will start to be large gaps in the clinical and care staff's ability to meet these specific outcomes that are linked to the standards. Those gaps will start to emerge. So what we want to try and prevent happening for you all is that, and we've got a suggested timeline and plan for when you can start to think about this, but think about education on the standards and then education to meet what's in the standards. And that's the approach we're taking. We're looking at how do we get a general suite of modules out to you at the appropriate time to build staff knowledge around these general requirements, but then ensure that you're supported with specific modules that can help address the outcomes specifically of the standards. So we want you to be providing education general on the standards and also thinking about what's actually in the standards, what are the educational requirements that are in the outcomes and the actions of the standards, and how do we ensure that our workforce is able to meet them. Third key change, let's think about it as effective education, because I was chatting to L&D manager last week, and there is a lot of, I guess, uncertainty around what the word competence means. What is competency-based training? How do we know if someone's competent? How are we measuring it? Do we need a framework? There are a lot of questions around competency. As I mentioned, we've got a webinar in June that is going to tackle this. But I guess to start off with, I want you to think, what does this mean? Why is there specific reference to competency-based training? And our assessment is that this is calling for the need for effective education. We need education to actually work. We have to measure it. We want the learning to result in a positive change in knowledge, skill, or practice. We want the learning outcomes to not just be met, to be sustained over time. We want the actual training and education that we have assigned and developed to actually go on to improve care, and we want to be able to evaluate that. So a key change that we've identified, and something, again, not to be overwhelmed by, but to be excited by, because this is a really great opportunity to step us all forward. And finally, I mentioned it earlier, but the fourth key change that we've identified, that's what's most relevant to you in learning and development, is a specific action 2.95. So we're talking about within Standard 2, and one of the specific actions that requires a provider to provide evidence that they've reviewed the training system's effectiveness. So what we're going to be able to support you with is to help determine, well, what is that effectiveness? What does it mean? How do I actually review it? When do I review it? What frequency do I review it? What is deemed to be a regular review? Is that quarterly, yearly, annual, biannually? What does this mean? We're going to unpack that over the journey of these webinars and provide some thought leadership around this, but it really does call out specifically in the standards that we can't just be thinking about the content of the training and the schedule, but the effectiveness of the system that we're using to manage that training. All right. Part 2, I'm going to quickly move into the results of our gap analysis, which is a really critical and big piece of work that we have done. And that's the purpose of this gap analysis has been to understand, what exactly are the identified education and training requirements coming from the new standards. So I want to just start, I guess, by reintroducing, just giving a little bit of a background to best practice and why not just we at Ausmed would do a gap analysis but really, I guess, show you why it's a critical part of your role. And if you're new to the role, perhaps it's a great opportunity to just take a moment here to look at it. So when it comes to best practice, we've got a really beautiful, really straightforward cycle that guides us to, develop education. And that's 3 phases. We have our planning phase, our implementation phase, and our evaluation phase. Planning is most critical. We know that planning, what is it? Prior planning prevents poor performance, and undertaking a gap analysis or with a gap analysis within an overall needs assessment really is the key to setting ourselves up well. It is the key to actually, running an education program that is focused on achieving the learning outcomes. And it means that we've got some strong data that we can use when it comes to evaluating the effectiveness of that education. So the approach that we took was that before we thought, what education, on the new standards, or what are the modules that we need to revise to align with the new standards, we have to drill deep and understand what those specific needs are. What are the drivers within this key piece of regulation? Where's education needed and where is it not needed? Because we know that education won't solve every problem. There are a lot of requirements within the standards that talk about systems, processes, and measuring those processes. So, education is key, and it is critical to helping build our workforce knowledge and ability to meet the standards. But there will be other activities within your organisation. Remembering that it takes a village, it can't just be up to us to help implement and transition to the new standards. Identify who are those key people within your organisation that are leading the working party or leading the implementation of the standards. They will have a slightly different angle to what you are looking at, but your focus is, what are the training requirements within the new standards, and how do I ensure that our organisation is meeting those? So in terms of the process, we started with clinical governance. So we really went deep in understanding what the regulation is, the new regulatory model, and then that led us into conducting a really quite a substantial gap analysis. We obviously mapped the old standards to the new standards, and we focused on outcomes, remembering that that's the enforceable element of the standards. I've got this resource for you to show you at the end, but I really used and leaned into the guidance material for each individual standard, and they really nicely map the key concepts associated with each standard. So if you see on the left, you've got the actual 7 standards, and then the next column over, you've got the outcomes listed for each standard. From there on, you can start to see, what are the key concepts and where do I need to direct, my attention. So if you can see, we've got 62 key concepts within Standard 5 clinical care, and we've identified 75 training requirements stemming from that new standard. That's not a surprise, obviously, because there are a lot of outcomes associated with that standard, but it was also developed in partnership with the Commission and the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. So clinical care really is a big standard. It's had a lot of great work done to it, and it's really clear that there are some key requirements that stem, from that standard specifically. What that leads us is, a really deep and clear level within Ausmed to what education is needed. So we've identified over, I said over 100, I think there's 142 specifically key educational requirements from the new standards. And that's really guiding us and supporting us to plan and prioritize the new modules that we're working on. So I'll show you a timeline shortly that will give you a real visual guide as to what's happening when and how we can support you. And what's clear though is that there's lots coming from us, lots of new things, everything is being updated. And there's a lot of work happening from our wonderful team at Ausmed to really ensure that we are best able to support you all. What I'll move on to now, though, is probably what we're, as practical people, many of you are nurses, I know, we need a plan. We've had new information on the key changes. We're looking at what that gap analysis is showing, but I'm thinking, okay, what do I do next? What's the next steps for me? We've broken that down into key steps. So the first thing that we'd recommend is to conduct a gap analysis yourselves if you haven't already, to determine what exact educational requirements you believe your staff and your teams need, and to really uncover what's missing. I would encourage you, while you're undertaking that process, to think about what don't we need? What's maybe sat in a training plan for a long time and it's just there because it has to, it's always been there. But is it actually needed? Because we know that there are quite substantial numbers of educational requirements. We need to be thinking about what's going to be targeted, what's going to be effective, what's actually going to engage our learner and to help translate that knowledge and that information into practice. So be ruthless when you're undertaking this process to determine what exactly is needed. I said we would be providing lots of support, and I meant it. We've taken our gap analysis process and tool. It's a beautiful spreadsheet, and you can scan the QR code to request a copy of this training analysis. And we hope that that will be a really practical tool that you can all use to get started. So you can use this spreadsheet to help analyze what your training requirements against the new standards are, and start to flag what might be missing, what do you think that your organization may need specifically. So scan the QR code. I'm going to move through slides, but if you haven't got a chance, if you're grabbing your phone, I'll post that slide up again at the ends to make sure you don't miss out. So step one though, conduct a gap analysis. Step two, I guess, is to, we'd encourage you to consider what we're calling a two-phase training rollout plan. And that talks to what I mentioned earlier about we need to be providing that general training on the standards. We suggest somewhere between April and June as a good time frame to deliver that training. And what we're thinking is, a real short, sharp focus of 3 months of training. So alongside that general training, we'd recommend that obviously starting this internal needs assessment or gap analysis for what we suggest in phase 2. And that's training in the standards. So thinking about at least, at a minimum from July onwards, assigning and really looking at activities that are focused on those high-risk clinical and care skills that we've identified in the new standards. This will be ongoing, that ongoing targeted education where our estimate is aiming for at least 35 items per annum, but thinking about what's the best format for that module, looking at the duration, looking at the quality of that module to try and meet the, what we know is, the L&D budget with both time and resources. So think about phase 1, phase 2. Now though, we're looking at what are our internal gaps and thinking about some general training to start giving to staff. Alrighty, part 4, excited to share, a few more resources and practical support. not just from Ausmed, but a range of commission resources that I've touched on. So what you have in front of you here is our rollout, so our timeline for all of the key changes that you can expect to help support you from now until, well, not just until July 1, but obviously because our support extends beyond that. But here is our plan. So starting from the top, we've broken up this rollout plan into 4 parts. The new content, so new modules that you can expect, how we are approaching the updating of existing content, what will be changing in the LMS, what you can expect there, and then, of course, that ongoing support, education and resources. So starting from the top, you can expect in March a general module on the strengthened aged care quality standards to be released. From then, so between the end of March and the start of June, we are also releasing 7 specific modules that have been designed to help meet the outcomes of those individual standards. And they will be those shorter, sharp modules that will be released sequentially between the end of March and the start of June. We've obviously got the new Aged Care Act that will be the basis of a lot of information and help pull this all together. So it's a little bit tricky to predict exactly when that resource will go live. It obviously hinges on when that regulation and legislation is passed, but sometime in the month of June, there will be a module released on the new act. And then from June onwards, you can expect really a steady stream of modules published that help meet, as I said, those specific high-risk clinical and care topics. As many of you would know, we've obviously got an extensive library of resources already that really do align beautifully with the new standards, but they need to be updated. References, resources, mapping against the new standards from the old standards, terminology changes. We are not in the new aged care quality standards referring to the client or consumer. Aligned with the person-based, the rights-based person-centered care theme that is truly prevalent, throughout that document, is the referring to the older person or older people, not the client or consumer. So a beautiful change. As I mentioned, I'm a nurse, and I think, holistically, words really do matter. So when we're going back truly to the person and showing that dignity and respect to the person. So I'm excited by that change. But of course, for us, that's one of the key things is making sure that terminology in our existing content is up to date. I've spoken to a lot of you already, and I know you're all very excited about what we're doing with the learning management system, the Ausmed LMS, and what we are releasing is the ability to report not just against the standards, but to the outcomes of the standards. So with the change to the enforceable element being the outcomes, we obviously think it's critical that you're able to have content mapped and map your own content to not just the standard, but the outcome of a standard, and then generate a report of learning against the outcomes as well. So that's really exciting. And of course, new training plan and training plan templates will be released as that content is released. We'll be updating and sharing some new templates with you as well, which makes things really easy. I've talked about it already, but just to really highlight, there's 6 webinars. Couldn't possibly cover everything today, so I really encourage you to register for as many of those as you can. From February, so from now, you'll be able to request a copy of the free gap analysis tool. And then beginning April, we'll be able to book you in, and we hope to see as many of you as possible, but I do encourage you to get in quickly, and that's for a training plan review consultation. So that's where we'll be able to actually sit with you, look at that spreadsheet, look at your training plan requirements, and help get things right. And then, of course, we don't just leave you high and dry. From July onwards, we've not just got the webinar on reporting, but of course, ongoing support, because these things take time. It takes time to implement change, and we know that additional support will be required from July 1 onwards. So just to finish off part 4, so that we can allow time for questions, I want to highlight a couple of additional resources, and I guess that's because it's really important that you see Ausmed's scope as Ausmed helps me make sure that my training requirements align with the new standards, and I feel I've got the practical support to implement those. But you will have so many other questions around the standards, the regulatory, the model, the act. We would do our best to share those with you, but I really do encourage you to visit the Commission's consultation page, and when we share the webinar recording and the slides, the links to all of these pages are in there. But there are some critical pages and resources that I suggest you have a look at. So that's what the page looks like. One of the key resources are the draft guidance material. So for each standard, there's a draft guidance material, and that PDF is intended to support you to actually comply with the strengthened standards. So it really looks at practically what do I need to do in relation to that particular standard. The next key document, it's all on this page, that I really recommend you having a look at is the audit methodology. So that there's a lot of changes to the way auditing is happening. There might be a sigh of relief as I say this, but at the webinar on the 6th of Feb, the Commission announced that because of the change in audit methodology, there's basically no unannounced visits. The audit process will start with an RFI, so a request for information. So that evidence collecting will be not just in person and on site, but be a combination of written material that you supply beforehand and even virtual meetings. So that information is covered in the audit methodology document linked to on this page. And another key document that we've used in our gap analysis, which I really recommend you having a look at, is the evidence mapping framework. So what that is it actually gives you insight into the evidence gathering processes. So it is providing a standardized set of questions and examples delineated between what will be asked at the provider level and what will be asked at the service level. And they actually go through every single outcome and identify or give clarity on what they will be expecting and what evidence they will be asking. So, again, I can't stress enough that outcomes really matter. We're designing our modules and education on outcomes, and the auditing process is really relates to the outcomes. So I'll just go back a slide. The Commission webinars, I think I saw a question pop up. We might have popped in the chat already the link to it, but the webinar from the 6th of Feb was absolutely critical, and they'll announce, I think they give about 2 weeks notice when the next webinar is. So I really encourage you. They're also on a Tuesday, so make sure that you stay tuned for those as well. We've done all of them. There's a lot of questions that come from it, but they're really wonderful at providing as much practical support as possible. Okay, so almost at time. If you didn't get a chance before, here's the QR code. Make sure you scan that to request your free copy of our training analysis. And if you head to this page, again, you can scan the QR code, or it's providers.ausmed.com.au/standards. And that's where you can find a substantial amount of information. So you can register for all the upcoming webinars at that page. you can keep up to date with when the new modules and resources are going live. We can show you and explain a little bit more information on the LMS changes to support the strengthened standards. There is a copy of the roadmap of support, so the beautiful timeline that really details when you can expect the changes to occur, and you can get a copy of the or request your copy of the training analysis at that page as well. So thank you. I am going to take a pause, have a sip of water, and we'll have a look at what questions maybe have come through the chat, but also encourage anyone to pop your mics off and fire away if there's any questions.
Thanks, Zoe. That was super informative and really good to see some of the things that we can apply in the workplace at the moment. I think some questions were around the Commission's webinars. So Renee has wonderfully replied to those chats. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask live? Well, we can take it as a shy group. Oh, yeah, go for it.
No, sorry, I put my hand up. In the old standards, they had an assessment tool that was helpful in terms of assessing your services, and in that it produced a improvement plan. Are we going to have a similar one with these new standards? Because I haven't seen any tool on the website as such.
Thanks, John. Yes, the audit methodology document, I'll post the link in the chat here for you now. That is fabulous. So that terminology probably changed, but it's setting out that audit and assessment process. So that and the evidence mapping document, I think they're long documents, but they're very, very useful and practical in nature. So I think that's your best bet to go to.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for the question, John. I think so. It echoes that. All right, any last questions before we pack up for the Tuesday? Oh, Cassie, bring it.
There's a good one in the chat, yeah.
Just about the skills passport models. I'm assuming that you're working towards updating those. Do you have a sense as to what they will be and when they will go live?
Did you catch that, Zoe?
It was a little bit hard to hear.
Sorry, I just realised my mic flipped up. I was just asking about the skills passport. So assuming that those modules have been mapped and that you're going through a process of updating them probably for 1 July, but do you have a sense of what they might look like, just that we can start to factor that in with our partners as well?
Are you happy for me to answer that one, Michelle, or jump in if you'd like? But yes, absolutely. All modules that are currently in the passport and mapped to the standards are undergoing a process of review. So we can keep you specifically up to date, if you like, on that one, but that'll be something that we share progressively over the next couple of months. You're on mute, Michelle.
You're very good lip reading. I think Cassie will be looking more at content adjustments or flagging any changes to those modules rather than pulling out modules and having them expired and putting in new modules in terms of the passport case. But we'll keep you updated. It being February, I've got a little bit of time to finalise that. Thanks.
Fabulous. And I'm Marg, posting the link right now to the actual Commission website, and that is the guidance resources. So I will share that with you in a sec. I'll just bring the link up. But thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to supporting you over the next few months and hope to see as many of you as possible at the next webinar next month. Thank you.